So I often get asked when the Marlins come to town to play the Braves if I'm cheering for the Marlins or the Braves, and the answer is very simple. I'm cheering for the Braves because the Marlins fired me. It's great to be here. It's great to see the crowd continue to grow. Heath, thanks for all your efforts and all the volunteers that have been able to come together and pull this off. It's truly astonishing to see this movement continue, and it's refreshing. We all go back to our own corners and have to carry the message, but this is certainly a great place to charge up the batteries as we go through this. So I need everybody to be extra special, nice to me when you see me for the next couple of hours. It's been really rough the last 2 months. I've been out of elected office, and it's really been a hard transition. I've been at all my kids' games on time. I'm coaching one of my 12-year-olds. I'm sleeping extremely well. It's a really tough period of time for our family, so I want to make sure everybody knows it. So all things go back to baseball in my life and in our house. I learned a lot of lessons on the baseball field, and sometimes there's some interesting conversations in the business world. I'll be sitting there and somebody will be talking about where they really learned to deal with stress, when they worked at Goldman Sachs, and they were dealing with this merger, and there was 2 publicly traded companies, and somebody was under investigation, and that's where they learned to deal with stress. And I tell them, well, I learned how to deal with stress on a AA baseball field with the bases loaded, no outs, and I haven't thrown a strike in 7 minutes. So baseball has taught me a lot, and it continues to teach me a lot. And one of the examples I think that is a current example is what Major League Baseball is currently doing. And for any baseball fans here, you know that they're going through this kind of radical rules change. They're changing the rules of the game to try to speed up the game. And there was an interview the other day that caught my attention during a spring training game with Dusty Baker. Dusty is the current manager of the Astros, former manager of the Nationals. I don't know if you're Nationals fans or Astros fans, but he had really good perspective, right? And this guy's a legend. But his perspective was, look, it's an awkward time. Change is awkward. And it's certainly in baseball. But Major League Baseball, of course, did their homework. And they made sure that they surveyed the fans. And they made sure that the movements that they were making made sense. But his comments were really centered around, you're either going to be really good at the change or you're not going to be good at the change. And if you're good at the change, you're going to win. And if you're not, you're going to lose. And I think there's some parallels to the Republican Party and conservative movements in general. If we're not willing to accept change, we're going to keep losing. And to me, one of the scariest thoughts, political thoughts in my mind, is that we could all be sitting in this room in 2025, and President Biden could still be the president. And we could still watch this play out, despite the national polling and the national information that's out there. Only 44% of Americans have an approval rating favorable. 27% actually think this country's headed in the right direction. And he's asking for the job for another 4 years at the ripe age of 86 at the end of his second term. And so with all of that information, I think there's some serious pause, because it should be easier than this. Right? An additional 4 years of a Biden administration would allow us to continue to see unexplainable decisions like Afghanistan and others. We would continue to see soaring national debt, which is paralyzing and destabilizing. And we would continue to see horrible ideas like $400 billion student loan bailout programs just show up. I think the most concerning part right now is that regardless of whether we agree or disagree on the Biden administration's decisions, I think we almost all agree on the process that they go through to make those decisions doesn't feel orderly. It feels like they're made in a silo. It feels like they're made with lack of consensus. It feels like many of them are made with a political motivation. But I'm a realist. And I know that there are a number of conservatives that, if given the chance to vote for Joe Biden or Donald Trump, would vote for Joe Biden. And I know that there's some in this room that would do the same thing, and I'm not mad. I get it. But you know what? This is America. And you deserve, and I deserve, and every American deserves a better matchup than Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And I think we have to, in a bipartisan way, both parties have got to find the resolve to work through this process and to be able to put a better slate of folks forward for these primaries. I want to rebuild the Republican Party. I've dedicated my future in trying to do that. And to do it, it's a lot of hard work. I think it's going to be worth it. In fact, I know it's going to be worth it. And every time I stare at my kids, I know it's going to be worth it. And so we can't just talk about healing and rebuilding. We've got got to actually have a plan. We've got to have a strategy. So I want to talk about today briefly a 5-step strategic roadmap to try to execute this to improve my party. Try to win the White House in 2024 as our focal point. Number one, we have to be more than just anti-Biden. Right? We can't just walk up to every microphone and every Twitter post and just be anti-Joe Biden. Right? We watched what that looked like for Donald Trump in 2020. We watched what the midterms look like in 24. Anti-Joe Biden is not a winning strategy. And we finally gotten through this phase as Republicans where you need more than a heartbeat and a Donald Trump endorsement to actually win an election. Right? If you don't have to go any further than David Perdue and Herschel Walker in Georgia. So number one, we've got to be more than anti-Biden. Number two, we've got to be more than just anti-Trump. And look, this one's hard for me. Right? I had my family attacked in the media. I've had my own profession. This is a hard one for me. I wake up most days not liking Donald Trump. In fact, every day. But you know what? It's not enough to just be anti-Donald Trump, you know. And it's real, right? We sit there and stare at these statistics. But we've got to realize that in order to win, as conservatives, we're going to need to still pull in some of those folks that actually like Donald Trump, actually think he did a great job all the way through the finish line. We're going to need those folks to come get with us, probably because they just realize it's the only pathway to win. But we've got to make our message more than just anti-Biden and more than anti-Trump. And in that vein, right, we still have to call balls and strikes on Donald Trump. We've still got to hold him accountable for the things that we think weren't run properly to put us in a position not only to win elections, but how he governed the country. So number three is we've got to make the case to voters all across our country that Donald Trump isn't truly a conservative. Because he isn't. Right? And when I start to unpack it for diehard Trump supporters, right, their head first starts to explode. Actually, their mouth starts to explode. But then you watch them start to listen, and normally they don't agree with me, but they just don't say much. They get quiet because when you start to unpack the notion of really how is he a conservative, right? We heard drain the swamp. I'm going to give credit where credit's due. Drain the swamp is probably the greatest campaign slogan ever given, right? It is unbelievable. From now until the end of time, it will be the greatest campaign slogan ever. Drain the swamp. But if you ask yourself, did Donald Trump really drain the swamp? The reality is we are $7.8 trillion more in debt after his 4 years. $7.8 trillion worth of additional national debt. And business as usual at the White House, right? As time goes on, we hear more and more stories about those who had the most access got the most toys. Donald Trump didn't drain the swamp. He fed the swamp. And we have to remind voters all over the country, the most diehard conservatives, that is truly the case. I think we also have to hold him accountable that he didn't get the COVID situation right? He wants to whitewash history now and act like he had all the great moves, but I got to feel this firsthand in Georgia. You know, when we were trying to reopen our state in an orderly, safe fashion, trying to allow small business owners to support their families and to support their communities, he was picking on us on every stage possible, calling us reckless and irresponsible, only because it fit his current narrative. He was attacking us on every single angle. You know, I think as history goes on, Donald Trump and the Oval Office will be just as accountable for making some of the bad decisions as Dr. Fauci's office was, as time continues to go on. Thank you. You know, and all of this is easy to explain. It's difficult, it's hard to hear, but it's easy to explain. Donald Trump isn't a conservative, he's a populist. And so whichever way the wind's blowing that day or that week or that tweet is which way he's going to follow. All right, number 4. We have got to have an adult conversation, a meaningful adult conversation about our out-of-control federal spending. We are $31 trillion in debt. And we, as in Democrats and Republicans spanning multiple administrations, have put 60% of our federal spending in a lockbox that we can't touch: Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, Social Security. I have no desire to get rid of any single one of those programs. I've watched my parents thrive on Social Security and Medicare. I've watched individuals in my state get back on their feet with Medicaid. I've seen it happen, and it works. I don't want to eliminate these programs, and we as Republicans shouldn't want to eliminate these programs, but we should want to modernize these programs, make them more accountable, more efficient, more effective, just like the private sector does in all of the ways they deliver health care and retirements. We've got to be willing to have those tough adult conversations as conservatives and lead the charge. And if we only think in 2-year increments, right, if we only think about election cycles, we're never going to have the wherewithal to have that adult conversation across our country. If we don't figure this out, the global markets will figure this out. And I guarantee you it will be more painful than an adult conversation in a political setting. Number 5, last but not least, we've got to start competing in the suburbs again. All over the country. We've given up on trying to court the suburbs. I live in Forsyth County, Georgia, which is like the epitome of suburban America, right? It's about 30 miles north of Atlanta, and I call it, there's about 4 counties that it looks like an eyebrow over top of the city of Atlanta. And they determine every election, right? Those are the folks that are used to having tough conversations at work. They're used to answering tough questions, giving tough questions. Those are the folks that show up informed, right? There isn't enough votes in rural America for Republicans to win large elections anymore. We've got to be able to focus in on how we get the suburbs to vote for us. Donald Trump got 2 million less suburban votes in 2020 than he did in 2016 because they grew tired of him. We've got to go back to trying to attract the suburbs if we're going to try to win these general elections. So, how do we break the strings of gravity? How do we move forward? How do we put a plan in place that allows us to actually accomplish these 5 steps? I talked about this last year, and I talked about it a lot in my book. I call it the PET project, policy, empathy, and tone. Right? We've got to go start leading with our policies. We don't believe our policies because they're politically expedient as conservatives. We believe them because they work. It's the best way to be fiscally responsible. It's the best way to protect your communities. It's the best way to educate your kids. We believe in conservative policies because they work, and we need to remind voters all across the country that our policies are effective. We need to use empathy, genuine empathy, not photo ops or campaign opportunities. We don't need to show up in Ohio when trains derail and cause great harm in those communities just because the wind isn't blowing and our hair's not going to get messed up that day, or because it's a slow news cycle. We need to show up because it matters, because we truly, genuinely want to know how we can help those people, how we can institute rules and regs or legislative priorities. That's true empathy. That will grow the size of the tent over time. And we've got to use tone, a better tone. Right? We can't use Twitter as the only source of getting our message out. We've got to take that message to Main Street. We can't just own the libs every time we send a 280-character tweet out. We've got to genuinely care about moving the message down the road. We need to focus our words on healing and rebuilding the country. There's a story I talk about in my book. I've got 3 sons, 20. My oldest son's actually interning in Washington, D.C. now at the Capitol. But he's in Atlanta today, and I'm in D.C., so we missed each other. He's probably hoping I bought him dinner. And I have a 17-year-old and I got a 12-year-old. My middle son, years ago, he got invited, we both got invited to go to a small group for church. And he was transitioning from elementary school to middle school. So they got all of us dads together and we had a campfire. And at the end of it, the small group leader gave all of us dads a wooden coaster and a Sharpie. And he said, write an encouraging note to your son. Put something on there that they're going to take with them into middle school. And I was completely flat-footed. It's probably the first time in my life I didn't know what to write or say. But I eventually caught my thoughts, and I wrote on this little wooden coaster with a Sharpie, doing the right thing will never be the wrong thing. Love, Dad. And I gave it to him, and he probably came upstairs and he threw it in a drawer, and probably, I figured he'd never look at it again. Fast forward a few years, the heat of the moment, Donald Trump is calling me everything but a child of God. I'm on television, Twitter. I had to put my phone in a sock drawer just so I couldn't hear it vibrate. Life was tough. But my son walked downstairs. He walked up to my desk and he took that coaster and he sat it on my desk and he said, Dad, doing the right thing will never be the wrong thing. That moment gave me all I needed to continue to stay strong. I think there's a lot of context that we all know the right thing to do. I think there's even folks out there championing Donald Trump's next campaign. They know the right thing to do. We know the right things to do as Americans. But I can guarantee you we will win if we do three things. We will win a conservative will be in the White House in 2024 if we do three things. If we focus our campaigns on the policies that matter. If we just simply put forward conservative solutions and we champion all across the country. If we use a tone that invites people to join us on this journey, a tone that's encouraging, that sounds like the boardroom, that sounds like the ball field, that sounds like the kitchen table. And last but not least, if Donald Trump's not our nominee. If we do those three things, I can almost guarantee you that we will have a conservative in the White House in 2024. And look, I'm optimistic. It's just my nature. I'm optimistic. And I think America is only one once-in-a-generation leader away from getting back on the tracks. I think this history has been very memorable of presidents that show up in tough times and are great leaders. I think this country is ready and thirsty for a great leader once again. Selfishly, I hope that leader is a conservative. Thank you all so much for the opportunity. Thanks for the hard work that you're doing back home.